I think I'm going to hire Annetta to, actually, if I look beat red, it's because nobody's ever introduced me with such verve and detail. But thank you very much, and thank you, Scott and Annetta, for organizing this very important event, and I'm so happy to see our honored guests here as well, and other linguists and folks around the world, and I hope Roger Shai is watching. I came to forensic linguistics from a slightly different path than most forensic linguists because typically we do defense work, but I came through prosecution, FBI, and like that. So I'll just take a second and tell you my background. I have a rather odd background for a linguist because I was trained by two really fabulous intellects, William Diver at Columbia, who founded the Columbia School of Linguistics, which is essentially a functionalist semantics theory. Sorry for the jargon to the non-linguists, but the important part about that is it's a theory of how these sounds that we are making somehow get interpreted as meaning. As we say in linguistics, it's always astounding that this happens because there are few things more different in the world than sound and meaning. The predominant theories right now in American linguistics are avowedly not fact-based, avowedly not evidence-based, Chomskyanism. Margaret looked at me. And Chomsky likes to disavow actual behavior, whereas European functionalists and Columbia School people don't. So I had that training, and I also was trained by William Labov, then of Columbia, now of UPenn, who is the founding father and still tremendously active in what is called variationist sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is the field that looks at language on the ground, where the rubber meets the road, as the old commercials used to say. So I had both the semantics and the sociolinguistics, which also those two people were not the best of friends, was an odd background. Then I was adopted by Roger Shai much later in my career and trained specifically in using our theoretical apparatus for solving linguistic problems of the law. What in the law is not language? We testify, we write opinions. Even if I were a forensic chemist, I would still testify in language, right? So anyway, so I was working as a linguist, and every now and then some lawyer would approach me to do a contract case or an insurance case, and one day I got a call from the Pennsylvania State Police Major Crimes Bureau, and they said that they had two documents that they wanted me to look at. A woman's husband was discovered a letter from a stalker saying that this guy had had an affair with the wife, and she had ratted him out to the person's fiancé, and who left him, and now he was back in town and the time was right for payback. So of course everybody was very scared about that. Then the woman was found strangled to death in her own car, parked outside a supermarket. Then as the investigation started to continue, another letter surfaced written by an avowed serial killer who said, this is the fifth woman I've killed, I'm getting good at it. She tried to break it off, so I broke her neck. So they said to me, what can you tell us about whoever wrote these letters? And later you're going to be taking a look at these letters, and you can try your hand at linguistic demographic profiling and authorship analysis. No, really. So working on that case, which resulted in conviction for first-degree murder, I became acquainted with Jim Fitzgerald, who Scott mentioned, and who had worked on the Unabomber case, among other things, and was the head of the Behavioral Analysis Unit Forensic Linguistics program at the time. And he was doing these week-long intensive training sessions for BAU agents and other agents, allied countries agents, and he recruited me down to Quantico where I helped him train these people, and I worked on cases, and I also tried to improve the CTAD, the Communicated Threat Assessment Database, which was a collection of all criminally oriented communications collected by the FBI, which Jim started. So then I teamed up with Roger Shai, and as you heard, I've worked on quite an array of cases, and I'm lucky to have done that. So the first slide I'm showing you, and also, although I work a lot with non-native speakers of English cases, that's not going to be my focus here. I was asked to give a general overview of forensic linguistics and then talk about the Innocence project that we founded at Hofstra. So language evidence can solve and prevent crimes was our mantra in the BAU Forensic Linguistics Services. Every time Jim and I would do a training for agents or police or investigators somewhere, somebody would come out of the audience and say, you know, I never realized that. I never thought about it in so many words. We have a cold case. Woman was murdered. We found letters at the scene, but we never knew what to do with them. Could you guys take a look at it? So I think I'm just going to give you 3 slides that pack a lot of information in and let you read it now that I've given you that brief introduction. Would it be easier for the interpreters if I spoke aloud?
Let me check in with my client. Thank you.
Very good.
I can read. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So we've had a lot of success being admitted. A seminal book speaking of crime by Lawrence Solon and Peter Tiersma, written around 10, 12 years ago, said, well, you know, we're still having a lot of problems being admitted, what with Daubert and everything, but I've been admitted under Daubert and Fry many times. Well, it depends on what you mean by many, but apparently we have overcome that. So we'll touch on all of those topics as we go on. In the United States, and I bring this up because we have an international audience, every time someone is proffered as an expert, it's pretty predictable that the other side is going to try to knock him out, or her. Whereas this is not the case everywhere else in the world. But it's pretty reliable here. So this is my voir dire resume, and on the basis of this, typically I am at least admitted as an expert, but then the big fight is, oh, but not in this case, Judge. Yes, our honored guests are nodding knowingly. So far, in about the 12 years that I've been doing this a lot, I've been qualified in 12 states, 6 federal district courts, so around 25, something like that, times. And as we know in the law, most cases don't go to trial and are settled or pled out. So I've been involved with hundreds and hundreds, probably over 1,000 cases now of various kinds. The organizations that I head up are our graduate program in linguistics. My university, Hofstra, was farsighted enough to allow me to start the first degree program in forensic linguistics in the Western Hemisphere. England and Spain have them, but there were none here. And since its inception, it's been very, very popular with students. The administration told me, look, if you get 1 the first year and 3 the second, we're okay. And we got 30 the second year. So there's quite a pent-up demand. And we're also starting a joint JDMA program. So we're going to turn out Hofstra law degree students who are also fully trained forensic linguists. We have a BA/MA also, and the Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Threat Assessment and Strategic Analysis is our research arm, and the Capital Offense Innocence Project, which I'll talk about later, in my own consulting. It has been a good year for linguists. We saved the world last year. I mean, we do all the time, but usually it isn't as recognized in that movie. We also got the Unabomber into jail. There was a great series that had a character named Jim Fitzgerald, of all things, working on the Unabomber case. Highly scripted, as Jim points out. Jim, when he retired from the FBI, he and I brought the week-long boot camp up to Hofstra. This is before I even had a program, and we have run it ever since, these one-week intensive courses. I now also run a one-week intensive course with Dr. Tanja Christensen of the University of Copenhagen, who is the most active forensic linguist on the continent of Europe. So these are some of the recent cases that I and my colleagues have been involved with. The last two bullet points are a term that Roger Shy invented and published a seminal book called language crimes. These are crimes that you commit, sometimes you need ancillary actions as well, by uttering language. You perjure yourself. You solicit to murder. You conspire. You accept a bribe. These are things that we do essentially through language. And we don't always get it right. The use of linguistic science in the law at this point is probably like other forensic sciences 100 years ago. So you and I are murder detectives 100 years ago, and we come upon a corpse. And I say, what do you think, Joe? How long ago did he get killed? And you, Joe, go over, feel him, say, maybe, I don't know, 2 a.m.? So, okay, and we tell all the uniforms, round up everybody who was here at 2 a.m. That is the current state, unfortunately, of a lot of the analysis of language evidence in modern jurisprudence. And that's something that we hope to advance the ball on. We also do civil cases. When Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was up for the Supreme Court, I was approached by a group who was not pleased with that, I should say, and accused her of having plagiarized her Princeton honors thesis and wanted me to demonstrate that, if that were the case. Actually, they probably wanted me to demonstrate it if it wasn't the case, but I stuck to my guns. So the first case, this was the first case I ever did with my partner at Hofstra, Dr. Tammy Gales, and we were able to demonstrate that highly likely that she did not plagiarize it. And she became a Supreme Court justice, for which I like to take full credit. I was Apple's linguist against both Microsoft and Amazon in a trademark case, and on like that. So some of the audiences for training that we have done include the British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6. They asked me to organize training for them in the run-up to the London Olympics because they wanted an enhanced threat assessment ability, and I recruited Jim Fitzgerald and we went over there and trained them. And just like with Sonia Sotomayor, since nothing untoward happened at the London Olympics, I like to take full credit for that too. So just to give you an idea, this is one of the more famous linguistic demographic profiling cases. This is one of Roger Shy's. It's been, to be a famous forensic linguistics case doesn't mean it's very famous, but among those cases this is. So do you ever want to see your precious little girl again? The parents of a kidnapped little girl got this document. They went to the authorities went to Roger and said, what can you tell us about whoever wrote this? Because what forensic linguistics does is it makes the suspect pool smaller and smaller. We exclude people, exactly like DNA, by the way, in the sense that DNA, I'm told by the experts there, does not ever identify a single person. And when it's misconstrued that way, there have been some fabulous false positives cases, fabulously bad. So what they do is exclude people, and that's all we can do, is shrink the suspect pool. So read that note. And we'll see it again in a sec. Just to give you an idea, these are some of the linguistic investigative features that we use, and the most important ones on the bottom. Beware of disinformation. Never take anything at face value. Now, as investigators, we know that, but somehow we don't act on it. I have trained groups of forensic psychologists who, as soon as I give them a letter, they start psychoanalyzing, well, not psychoanalyzing, but analyzing the psyches of the people who wrote it. And I say, guys, no, it's a fiction. This is a masquerade, you see, because unless you're going to sign your name, your real name and address to the bottom, and I don't think you will in a ransom note, there's going to try to be some misdirection. So the technical term we do after analysis is, what do you got? What do we see here? We immediately see misspellings, right? Okay, so k sound is rendered as a k. So we start to construct hypotheses, and then we test the hypotheses. Which is the superior hypothesis? Well, one may be that the person comes from a language where you always write k for k sound, but wait a minute, we have Carlson, we have Cash, so that doesn't make a lot of sense. Then we see daughter is misspelled, cops, right, is misspelled, can is misspelled. These are pretty basic words to be misspelled. What's a competing hypothesis, anyone? Yes?
Precious is a misspelled diaper.
And precious is not misspelled, and diaper is not misspelled. Therefore, so what is your hypothesis? That's not a hypothesis, that's an observation, madam. Yes, I know, you know that.
It's not a hypothesis, it's an observation. I would think that this was
Make-believe. Yeah, disinformation. Right. And devil strip, which is easy to miss if you're a good reader, because, you know, good readers skip over things that don't immediately make sense. You ever seen the speed reader people, you know? Sometimes I have to work backwards through documents to make sure I don't miss anything. So we also have this word devil strip. So our hypothesis now is that someone is masquerading as someone who can't spell cops, but can spell precious. Yes, it's hard to construct that hypothesis. And then we have devil strip. So Roger Shai rather quickly said to the authorities, do you have on your suspect list a well-educated man from Akron, Ohio? And they said, I imagine they said, come on, Roger, normally this takes, a couple of weeks. You have to go look at your books, and you come back and you say, well, I'm not sure. Do you have anything else? Just look. I said, come on, Roger. Does he walk with a limp? Did he see service in India, as all the Sherlock Holmes things? He said, just look. And sure enough. What other mistakes showed that this was a well-educated person? And there's good news because they did have somebody from Akron. Oh, well, we'll get to that in a second. But what other indications in this document will tell us, if you look at it for around a month, which is what it took me, that the person's well-educated?
The structure of the presentation?
Yes, it's very, very well put together. That's very true. What else? Yes?
The single
That excellent grammar, right? And look at the punctuation. Beautiful. See?
Knows how to use an apostrophe.
Knows how to use an apostrophe.
It's telling.
It is, it is. Also,
Undergraduates.
that's right. Right. It's telling I teach undergraduates, yes. Was that a hand up? Okay. So, also, just the use of the word precious is actually indicative of someone who is very familiar with writing English. What is the function of the word precious there? I mean, what do most real ransom notes look like? Da-da-da, boom. That's it. Precious is the emotion. It's inducing this nasty, you're a precious little girl, mocking. You don't get that in somebody who can't spell cops, right? So anyway, Roger knew that the devil strip is that strip between the sidewalk and the pavement, which is a different set of words in England. But anyway, you get that's why I have this picture. But only in Akron, Ohio and its surroundings. And this was an excellent bit of data because if you have a word for this, the word I know is county strip because my father was a county official and I would never want to mow that, and he'd always say, "You're not mowing the county strip," you know, because you. And so I figured everybody called it that. But I find out, of course, most people don't have a word for it. Why would they, right? So if you do have a word for that, you assume that everybody has that word. So he didn't know when he put devil strip down there, he might as well have been saying, "P.S. I'm from Akron, Ohio." So let's look at some other punctuation things, right? In Spanish, as we all know, you begin with an inverted question mark. But it's so different that you're not going to do that by accident if you're a native Spanish speaker and you're writing a threat letter or something. But, for example, Spanish and other languages don't capitalize names of months, days of the week, nationalities, languages. So you say, "El español es una lengua bonita." So if we get, "I'm always watching when she goes to French class," it might mean nothing, or it might go along with other bits of data. And if we have a suspect pool in which one person is a native speaker of X, there we go. Here's another good one. This was in a case I had in California. "I challenge that you have the right to have her to yourself. I've known her since a very long time myself, perhaps even longer than you." Why French?
Because I speak French fluently, and I just noticed the since translated into French is depuis.
Right.
And that's why you would ask that.
Exactly. The gentleman says he speaks fluent French. He notices that this since, this isn't English. There's something slightly wrong with it for English. We say since 1942, but we don't say since a very long time. But that could easily be depuis longtemps, and indeed one of our subjects was French speaker, and that led us immediately to him, but I mean, we analyzed everybody throughout, but that was one additional bit of data that tilted towards him. Because it is hard to imagine a native English speaker doing this. But there was a whole string of features at the end of the day that indicated it was he. More punctuation. More French punctuation. So if you have a double punctuation, that is something that is not merely a comma or a period, you leave an extra space in French. So this is from an internet page that is explaining to us, English speakers, how to do French punctuation. Is the writer of this internet page French or English or something else? Thoughts?
There's no space as colon.
Yes, because the person is writing in correct English. Okay? Okay, but that doesn't necessarily tell us if the person is French and knows English or is English and knows English. But good observation. And as we go along, it's good. There is no observation that is not loved. And you put it, maybe it's not going to tell us the demographic information, but later if we get a suspect, we might use it for comparison with exemplars. This isn't a legal case, but yes.
So the non-use of capitals after in bullet points of lists can indicate a non-native English speaker
The non-use of capitals where?
in a bulletin list.
Oh, in a bullet list. Okay, that could be. But there's better tells here. It's a good point, though. No, the punctuation doesn't tell us anything because,
No, the phrase, the French punctuation.
the French punctuation.
We wouldn't use.
How would you say that in French? Le. But we wouldn't say it in English. We would begin by saying French punctuation. And what else? Hint, it is garbled. It's not actually exactly what you would do in French, but it's sort of French-ish grammar. The plural of punctuations. See? So, likely French. And indeed, the person was identified as a French lady who was a teacher of English. So here's another masquerade. Not a very good job. I don't know, I clicked there and I didn't go where they said, so my professional advice, as I say there, is don't click there. So Roger was given the manifesto and a bunch of other documents authored by the Unabomber, by Jim and another agent or two in 1995. And at the moment, the profiling, they didn't really have much to go on. It was a terribly long and confused blizzard of input, and they came up with this sketch because somebody who looked like this was seen at the scene of one of the bombings, but it clearly was not Kaczynski. So Roger, who winds up in the Unabomber TV show as a postdoc who's helping Jim Fitzgerald with the case. Roger says, it's not a poorly educated young man, but it is a person in his 50s, highly educated, with an advanced degree, but the degree is not in the humanities, could be in math or chemistry or something. The person had lived in, but was not from the American West, had been raised in Chicago in the Midwest, and had been raised a Catholic, and had seen service in India and walked with a limp. No. Okay. So, in his 50s, he used terms like holy robots from a Batman TV show. He also used Reisman's sociological constructs, such as inner-directed and things. I had to study that too as a sociologist. And he was able to place from that, and then from another very, very interesting thing. The Unabomber misspelled certain words, but they weren't misspellings. They actually were following a suggested revamping of spelling from the Chicago Tribune's publisher. And once the guy passed away, the editor said, okay, now we can go back to regular spelling. But there was a window of time in which the misspellings were actually not misspellings, they were from the Chicago Tribune. So Roger was able to put him perfectly at that age. He was highly educated. Once they got the manifesto, it was clear that the person had high education, but the way he formatted, the way he cited was not the way somebody does in the humanities, and it wasn't up to snuff, and Roger knew that. He had lived in, but was not from the American West. He would write things like, I went out into the Sierra to get a breath of fresh air or something like that. But Sierra was the only Western topographical term he used. He never also used arroyo and all these other things. So this was consistent with somebody who had lived in, but was not from, because if they were from the area, they would use all these phrases. He used a term rearing children instead of raising children, which at the time was Northern City's dialect, Chicago. And he used terms like sublimation of one's sexual urges and other very, very Catholic teachings. And all of these were right. So as I was saying, profiling and then authorship are on a continuum. And this is poor Mrs. Hummert, who was strangled. So as we know, threatening letters were written to her. She was found murdered. Serial killer writes, and the police say what information is revealed. Could you do the handouts now, Scott? Thank you very much. So we're circulating a single page with a brief description of the case. Also, there's a couple of TV shows based on the case, is linguistic analysis as well, forensic files, for example, that include the linguistic analysis, and the actual data. And here are some linguistic investigative features. So I had a couple of months, so I figure I'll give you maybe 3 minutes. This, by the way, is what the handwritten one looked like, so I've transcribed it. And the stalker letter is the actual letter itself. It was typed on our computer. So since we have all of 3 minutes or 2.5 minutes now, I'll tell you that don't pay any attention to the capital Fs and things like that. That's all not masquerade, it's just disinformation. So just let's look at the language. Language is limitless. Every time I do a training, I have the people do the exercise you're doing. I've been doing this for years. Every single time someone notices something that I've never seen before. If you want to focus on just one thing, look at the serial killer letter and see if you can get some occupational or experiential hint.
Was to know something about technology and computers, cell phones.
Why? Someone who knows something about technology, cell phones, computers. All right, and what specifically are you looking at?
The pictures on PC and the cell phone, not in the name of the person.
Okay. More precisely, the use of the term,
Not under my name, PC.
yeah, PC, right. And the chief suspect was a computer specialist for the state police. So that was interesting. These two letters look very, very different on the surface, don't they? And of course, that's on purpose. But they're actually very, very similar under the surface. What I analyzed in the northern dialects of Swahili in Kenya for 6-7 years, I would make recordings in the northern dialects up by the Somali border and then analyze. One of the things that Bill Labov taught us how to do was to elicit stories, narratives, because what happens is people get very involved in the narratives and they forget they're speaking into a microphone to someone who might as well be a Martian. And they get so invested in it. I mean, in Detroit, in London, Bangkok, many other places in the world, I've elicited the prototypical Labovian story is a fight story, because you have to be in a fighting culture, but people get so invested in saying how they beat that guy, see? And then you segue from that into, wow, that's amazing. He almost, I mean, you could have died. Have you ever been in a position where you figured this was it? People who have had that situation really start telling you stories and they get invested, and then you go from that into, did somebody dream about it? And this is a way that we collect data. So what I did was I studied narrative structure, another very Labovian specialty. So when I look at anything, I see narrative structure. And the narrative structure in both of these documents is beautiful. This guy can write. He can do flashbacks, flash forwards. He can step out of the narrative stream and give information, even though it looks like a 2-year-old wrote the second note, you see? So that's a pretty good indication of some similarity. And then there was this other similarity that we noted, and there's more in here, but of course we don't have time. Sorry, yeah. It is actually in a similar dialect. There's no, say, quote-unquote Southern dialect or New York dialect. It has to be pretty much the same education level, the complex narrative structure, complex time shifts. I walked the jury through all of them. Plus, both letters share an uncommon literary device that we had to name. It was so uncommon. And I knew it was uncommon because I asked all the Latin and Greek professors, and they didn't know it. And then I went to BYU, which hosts the world's greatest compendium of rhetorical devices, and spoke to the curator. And he said, no, we don't have a name for that. It's in the general field of ploche, but we don't have a specific name. You know, John F. Kennedy very famously said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And he was accused of plagiarism because 20 other people had written that in the past century. Demosthenes used to use that. I mean, it's a classic rhetorical device. So that wouldn't have been as much of a telling feature as this one. So on the basis of this, the judge granted search warrant, and then I got to compare all of his writings. And we didn't find this device because it was mostly prison and work stuff, but we did find something really, really amazing. And this is our suspect, the husband, not surprisingly, I'm afraid. So there was a skewing, a categorical skewing in contraction patterns. Negatives, like did not, sometimes became didn't, sometimes stayed did not. But positives, like I am, always stayed I am, never I'm. Never seen that before, never seen that since. And I walked the jury through all of the writings. Now, mind you, Hummert was not convicted on the basis of linguistic evidence alone. I must say that the New Yorker article got that wrong, but I guess it made better journalism, as much as I love the New Yorker. There was quite a bit of other evidence. But this was another log on the fire, you might say. So look at this. In the known writings, we get that 0 in the lower left, no positive contractions out of 74 positives. And in the two other documents, the stalker and serial killer letters, out of 23, we get 0. In those days, we didn't know not to use Google, or I wasn't aware of better corpora, and that's another really important new thing in a language in the law. I think, was it BYU? Yeah, it was at BYU, a conference, a continuing series of investigations into, you might call it big data. We have these large corpora, like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, again hosted at BYU. Fabulous set of things there that we can use as baselines, and now, very importantly, people are using to try to understand the meaning of statutes and testimony. And my colleague, Dr. Tammy Gales, is an expert in corpus linguistics and was at the BYU conference. So we see that this is not a general pattern. It's not like everybody always eschews positive contractions. It just isn't the case. So then we figured, well, where do we really find weird contraction patterns in academic writing? But again, we don't have that skewing. So Hummert, as I say, not just on the linguistic evidence, but it was additive. So one way of looking at what we do is we help people get intelligence. And as I said, there's very little in the law that is not language. Every time we open our mouths or write anything, we're telling the world a lot more about ourselves than we might appreciate or might want. And if you try to hide, if you're good, I've never seen it. people say, oh, well, look how dumb these criminals are. I said, well, those are only the ones we catch, you know, I mean, the really smart ones. So maybe somebody has done a masquerade job so beautiful that went by me, see? But I know that typically what happens is people do not ratchet up or down or into a dialect or out of a dialect, all systems simultaneously, see? So there's something like that punctuation, there's something like that sense, you know, that stands out and says, no, this is not what we think it is or what it purports to be. So now let me go to the capital case innocence project. We've expanded from only capital cases. I was approached by a guy who in '96 was convicted of first-degree murder. And after we demonstrated that he had not written his confession, I thought in my naivete, I thought the cell door would swing open. Yeah, and that's 6 years ago now. And I discovered that he had expended all of his appeals. I went over to the law school where we have fabulous, brilliant constitutional law professor named Eric Friedman. And I said, why don't we work together? He said, look, Rob, I know that you think that, and it is very important evidence, but you're not going to be able to help him. So let's do something that will help other people. And since then, we've been working on other cases. But QB, as you will see, was lucky in that he was tortured. And that has allowed him to get new appeals. And there are other avenues as well. So QB says that he was beaten by the Chicago police, who at that time were unfortunately rather famous. There were a lot of court cases. There were people who had come out of the Vietnam War who had been pretty tough interrogators of Viet Cong prisoners, and they were using the same kind of electrical devices and beatings on them. But they would overdo it, and then the emergency room would find patterns, and that's why it all came out. So QB says he was beaten, but he did not write his own confession as they wanted him to, and then he was asked to sign a piece of paper to get his telephone call, and the next time he saw that piece of paper, it had this confession typed over it. So the authorship of the alleged confession is questioned, right? Q. So we have competing hypotheses that it best matches QB's own writings, and we have contemporaneous writings of his, letters to his aunt and to his girlfriend, or something else. And we actually have the testimony of one of the detectives who interrogated him, whom QB, interestingly, says was not the guy who wrote it. But as we will see, the linguistic patterns of people who work together all the time becomes very, very similar, right? Husbands and wives, detectives, knitting, bees. So we have all these documents that my students and I analyzed, and then we compared the testimony of Detective Jorgensen in the court trial as well. So linguists will note, and I will not go into too much detail for our poor non-linguists, complementizer deletion, which I don't think is really deletion, but we can have a theoretical discussion about that. I think it's insertion, but it's called deletion, so okay. Sorry, inside joke, guys. All right, contraction patterns, discourse markers, lexical choice, and syntactic structures. And the syntactic structure is quite interesting, too. So we have general findings that these features that we do find in the Q, the question confession, don't also appear in QB's known writings, but they do appear in the speech patterns of the officer. So in English, you can say, I know that he is here, or you can say, I know he is here. And if you don't have it, it's called typically complementizer deletion. And this is part personal preference, but it's also a function of how complicated the sentence is. The more complicated it is, the more likely you're going to put that. So if you run to more complicated sentences, you will also have more that's, and that's also a feature of your own style. But we don't have it at all. with QB. 8% versus 86%, and I'll just go through these quickly, and people who want the slides, I'll be happy to furnish them. Then we have contraction patterns, 17 versus 86. I did not know the gun was loaded, rather I didn't, I am. Also, I have to remind, to say in so many words that the officers now, of course, many times when officers get a confession, they assist the person in getting it down on paper. But that is not what was purported to have happened here at all. The officer said, we took down each and every word of his language. And that was the whole idea of the questioning. Did you write this? No. He wrote every single word of this. So discourse markers. Well, now, so even when QB writes, and QB, by the way, is trying to write in a formal style, as I'll show you, he will put in discourse markers. He'll say, well, check this out. Well, princess. But we find no discourse markers of any kind at all in the confession. We might expect more usage, as I say, of such markers in the Q doc than in the K, because the Q is a record of spoken language. The confession was spoken language, but of course it's a very formal thing. All right, so community of practice, again, I won't bore our non-linguists, but it's a group that works together towards a common aim, and your language becomes similar. And you get shortcuts, and you get things that work, and you stick to it. So we don't see a lot of match with QBs. And now we have lexical choice. QB says approximately, but of course he never says that in his writing. He says at an unknown time, which is in the confession, but oddly he doesn't say that in his writings. But again, if the theory was that the officers assisted him in getting his confession down, this would be appropriate, because QB would have said, well, it was at, I don't know if it was at 9 o'clock, well, at an unknown time. But again, this is exactly the opposite of what the officers claim. Then this syntactic structure is very interesting. Typically, you and I, we say, we ate dinner, then we went home. I got up, then I ate breakfast. Notice then plus subject. As opposed to, we ate dinner, we then went home. Okay? QB only has the canonical structure. But then I said, then he shut up. And by the by, while we're here, notice the formalism that QB is putting in. I told him, if I get out of my bed, I'm going to kick his ass very well. You see? That's best interpreted, I think, as a formalism. Okay. So the officer, though, says all three then went out. He doesn't say then all three went out. He then walked, not then he walked. And what do we find in the confession? Exactly the same pattern as the officer says, and exactly not the same pattern that QB says. And here we have the Georgia Commission letter. And this has been going on for a couple of years, but at least he is, they were very interested in these findings. Okay, so the last thing is sometimes we get in forensic linguistics a schema, and we try to, a narrative that we try to fit it in. We just have things that we've seen so many times, so we assume that's going to work. So here are 3 bomb threats made to a house in Beverly Hills, California, owned by a fabulously wealthy gentleman. This one has Jodie Foster in it. Okay, so this was a case brought to me by a bunch of ex-CIA agents who run their own intelligence agency, which had been brought to them by the head of the rich guy's security force And in case you don't know, high net worth individuals, rich guys and women, have their own security forces, of course. I've dealt with a lot of them at times, and a very interesting job they have. So they said to me, what do these mean? We've gotten 3 of these in 1 week, and by the book, you get 3 in a week, you really have to pay a lot of attention. Now, there are other markers here that the BAU would say are not indicative of high threat level. There's no personalization, there's no ancillary action, dead cats delivered to your doorstep and things like that. But still, it was very concerning to everybody involved. So, of course, I said, the first thing I said was, I hope law enforcement is involved in this, because I don't want to talk to you if you haven't. And they said yes. I said, good. Have them make a formal request to the FBI field office to request the BAU to run the CTAD on these. Because maybe we'll see gas bomb. That's not something you see in a lot of bomb threats. I know from CTAD. So, maybe somebody in Pittsburgh 10 years ago just got out of jail, and this is a good clue, narrowing the suspect pool. And they actually said, like it was in some bad movie, our local police don't talk to the FBI. I thought, oh, that's nice. Well, let's have a bomb go off because you don't talk to the FBI. They said, look, we have no control over this. I said, okay. So they kept, it was weird. It would make a very weird movie because they always called me while I was driving to and from Hofstra. So, I'm putting the earplugs in and they say, what do the capital B's mean in bombs? I say, I don't know. How, that it's John Smith on 123 4th Street, right? What do you want from me? I said, you're not going to run it through the CTAD, so I can't find out gas bomb. The only gas bomb I knew at that moment was the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway, but I doubted that was the same guys. And then Jodie Foster. So what you want something here is, there's not enough linguistic evidence to let us find who it is. So you want something in the real world. Now, Jodie Foster was an appropriate thing because, of course, she was the impetus for the shooting of Ronald Reagan and Brady, because a guy named Hinckley said, Jodie Foster doesn't know I'm alive, I'm going to shoot the president and then she'll know I'm alive. At least, well, it doesn't make a difference, but typically what you find in these, like celebrities, is people who have what's called erotomania. They believe that the object of their desire loves them too. And no amount of dissuasion will convince them. And we had a woman news lady on Long Island, unfortunately, who was stalked for years. Nothing she could do could get rid of this guy who would say, no, I know you love me and I love you. And finally, she convinced him that she didn't love him, and he decided that was because she had taken the place of the real woman, because the real woman loved him, and he killed her. So what do we got? Thinking outside the linguistic box. What do we see in these letters that is odd, that's out of the ordinary for letters? The what? The way the paper is folded is one thing. What else?
The writing of the words, like they're templates that he keeps using over and over again. They're written too carefully.
They look like a template. They're written too carefully. They're not written like a letter, right? Yes? Like a list. It's written more like a standard list would be. That's right.
One word per line.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Maybe from a language where you write vertically, people sometimes suggest. So, yes?
This house looks very generic. Did he try someplace else down the block,
This house looks very generic, and then maybe someplace down the block. We do have this odd repetition of here and this house. And this house in the Jodie Foster letter is out in the middle of left field, home plate, something like that, right? So each time I would drive to and from school and these guys would yell at me, I said, all right, so maybe I'm not thinking in the right way. Maybe I have to think outside what I normally would. So this is a slide I made for the Yale Sherlock Holmes Society. I couldn't, resist. But I realized the intent was that there was to be a bomb, but not at that house, or this house, but at Studio City on Ventura Boulevard, of course. See? Clear as mud. Because I thought maybe this isn't a letter, maybe it is a map. On the left is Jodie Foster's house, which I would like to say I got from my intelligence agency, but I looked it up on the website. And B is this house. And if you superimpose them, no one could ever have been more surprised than I was that this worked. And yes, I had to size it, but of course I did not change the orientation of things. And Gas Bomb is right at Studio City, which is a commercial hub. Thank you very much.
Would anyone like to ask questions? We have time for maybe 2 questions.
What current cases are you working on?
A terrorism case, federal terrorism case, where a non-native speaker of 3 languages has been accused of something, and that features largely into it. I was almost involved in the Trump Stormy Daniels case, but luckily was not. Then there's 2 other really high-profile cases that I can't mention, and 2 defamation cases, a trademark case. Other questions? We have time for one more? Yes?
So when you're trying to profile someone and you're bringing in all of this, like in the case of the Unabomber, when it was like, this person in Ohio and like spent some time in Chicago or whatever, it's just like, how do you bring in all these things that are so specific? How do you know those like little fine details? Is it just like the consequence of having like a team of people with a bunch of knowledge for each person?
The question is, how do we actually find all these fine details of, say, Akron, Ohio, and he was raised in Chicago and all that? The cases that I've given you came out of the head of Roger Shai, who, just have to be Roger Shai, I guess. Although these days we do have the internet, which helps, because I'm sure we would have just looked up Devil Strip right away. But yes, having teams are very, very important. At Hofstra and in my own work, I will not do anything except as part of a team. Because if nothing else, this is how you make sure no howling bad mistake goes out, because you just didn't happen to see it. So right from day one with that Hummert murder case, I have always worked. First I worked with Dr. Benji Wald, who was one of my mentors at Columbia, and he and Roger and I and Tammy Gales and others are always working together and checking each other's work and doing red team analysis, where we say, well, let's take the opposing hypothesis. What do we have here that maybe we're overlooking, right? And that's how we do it. But it is an interesting thing, and it was one of the things that amazed me at first, that there were so many details that could add up to quite a nice demographic profile.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.